Hello friends and history buffs, how are you? I hope everything is well. Today we are journeying into the story of a giant stretching from the steppes to the palaces, which I have thought about the most in my life, the Russian Empire. If you find this cold but magnificent historical journey interesting, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to join our family. Also, thinking of those famous Russian winters, I wondered, what is your favorite season? Let's meet in the comments. Frozen forests stretched endlessly northward, where winter claimed half the year and summer brought no respite from struggle. In this harsh land, a new force began to stir during 1462, while princes across the vast territories still knelt before Mongol Khanes, as their ancestors had done for over 2 centuries. Yet, in the wooden citadel of the Kremlin, a young man ascended who would change everything. Ivan III inherited a modest principality, one among many scattered across the Slavic lands. His grandfather had been a mere tax collector for the Golden Horde, gathering tribute from fellow Christians to send eastward to their overlords. But this heir possessed something his predecessors had lacked, an unwavering vision of what his homeland could become. Where earlier rulers had accepted subordination as natural, Ivan saw opportunity in the Mongol Empire's growing weakness. Mongol domination had strangled the Eastern Slavs since 1240, when Bachakon's horsemen swept across the steppes like a plague of locusts. For over 200 years, local rulers had traveled to Sarai, hat in hand, seeking permission to govern their own people. This humiliation burned in Ivan's soul like a constant flame. Yet, he understood that revenge required patience and careful preparation. Rather than challenge the Mongols directly, Ivan began systematically absorbing his fellow Slavic princes. His first target was Novgorod the Great, the ancient trading republic that controlled vast northern territories rich in furs and timber. The northern traders had made a fatal mistake by signing an alliance with Catholic Lithuania, giving Ivan the perfect pretext for what he proclaimed as a holy war against those who would betray Orthodox Christianity at Shaolin River. Ivan's disciplined forces crushed the Republican militia in a battle that demonstrated the new military methods he had learned from Italian engineers. Thousands died in the marshy ground, their blood seeping into the northern soil. Yet, even this victory did not bring complete submission. When Novgorod's leaders attempted to negotiate limited autonomy, Ivan returned with an even larger force, determined to end their independence forever. Ancient bells that had summoned citizens to assembly for 3 centuries were torn down and shipped to Moscow as trophies of conquest. Charters guaranteeing freedoms were publicly burned. Hundreds of leading families found themselves marched into exile, their lands distributed to Ivan's loyal servants. Never again would Novgorod challenge the Kremlin's supremacy, and the message spread to every remaining independent principality. One by one, these scattered realms fell to Ivan's expanding power. To Moscow's ancient rival collapsed without a battle when its prince fled westward rather than face certain defeat. The pattern was always the same: diplomatic pressure, military threat, and finally absorption into the growing Muscovite state. By the 1470s, Ivan had eliminated every center of authority that might challenge his supremacy, except for the Golden Horde itself. Ahmed Khan's demand for tribute in 1480 provided the moment Ivan had been preparing for throughout his reign. Instead of the traditional submission, Ivan's response shocked the Mongol court. He tore the Khan's letter to pieces and spat upon it. When ambassadors arrived demanding explanation, they were reportedly executed. Such defiance had not been seen for 2 centuries, and it meant war. Yet, when the armies finally faced each other across the frozen Ugra River, neither side dared make the first move. For months, the 2 forces remained in their camps. The Mongols expecting eventual Russian submission, and Ivan waiting for winter to make cavalry charges impossible. As the cold deepened and supplies dwindled, both armies began their withdrawal. No great battle was fought. No dramatic moment marked the transition. The Mongol yoke simply ended. With foreign domination finally broken, Ivan embraced an even more ambitious vision. If Moscow was free from Mongol control, why should it not claim the mantle of the greatest Christian empire? Rome had fallen to barbarians, Constantinople to infidels. Only the northern realm remained to carry forward the mission of Orthodox Empire. His marriage to Sophia Paleolog, niece of the last Byzantine emperor, symbolized this transformation, while Byzantium's double-headed eagle became Moscow's symbol of imperial power. This imperial vision required new methods of governance that could bind together the vast territories under Ivan's control. The service state he created revolutionized the relationship between ruler and nobility. Unlike Western feudalism, where land ownership created independent magnates, Ivan's system made all land conditional on service to the crown. Every acre was held in trust from the great prince, and that trust could be revoked if service was deemed inadequate. Rebellion became not just treasonous, but economically suicidal. When he even died in 1505, he left his son Vasily a united realm spanning from the Baltic to the Urals. But the work of consolidation was far from complete. Vasily III continued his father's methodical approach, absorbing the last remaining independent territories, while demonstrating the new state's growing military capabilities. The recapture of Smolensk from Lithuania after a century of foreign control showed that Moscow could now project power westward against European opponents, not merely defend itself against nomadic raiders. The regency crisis that followed Vasily's death in 1533 nearly undid everything the previous rulers had built. His 3-year-old grandson inherited the throne, leaving the realm in the hands of boyar factions who had never fully accepted the new autocratic system. For years, these noble families fought viciously for control, while the young heir watched helplessly. The chaos of these early years burned itself into Ivan IV's memory, creating the paranoid suspicions that would later consume his reign. When Ivan IV finally came of age and was crowned in 1547, the ceremony itself proclaimed a revolutionary change. For the first time, a Russian ruler was crowned not as great prince, but as Tsar, a title derived from Caesar that claimed equality with the Roman emperor and Byzantine Basileus. The boy who had witnessed the humiliation of royal authority during the Boer Regency was determined that such challenges would never arise again. The early years of Ivan's personal rule demonstrated the potential of the system his predecessors had created. Surrounded by able advisors, known as the Chosen Council, The young Tsar embarked on systematic reforms that touched every aspect of life. Professional infantry armed with firearms provided a disciplined military corps that could maintain order in peacetime and fight effectively in war. New law codes replaced the chaotic patchwork of local customs with uniform standards of justice. Administrative efficiency gradually replaced the arbitrary rule of bare favorites. These domestic achievements set the stage for military adventures that would announce Russia's emergence as a major power. The conquest of Kazan in 1552 represented more than just another territorial acquisition. It was the symbolic reversal of centuries of Tatar dominance. The Khanate that had terrorized Slavic lands fell to Ivan's modern forces after a siege that showcased the latest European military technology. When Astron followed 4 years later, Russia controlled the entire Volga river system from Moscow to the Caspian Sea, for the first time since the Mongol conquest. The balance of power in Eastern Europe had fundamentally shifted. Where once Russian princes had trembled at the sound of Tatar war cries, now Russian armies dictated terms to Tatar survivors. Orthodox churches rose where Islamic minuets had stood, and Russian administrators governed territories that had been centers of Muslim power for centuries. Success against the declining Tatars bred dangerous overconfidence, flushed with these eastern victories. Ivan turned his attention westward to the Baltic lands controlled by the fading Livonian order. What began as a campaign to secure windows to Europe escalated into a quarter-century struggle that would expose the limits of Russian power and ultimately transform Ivan himself from a reforming monarch into the terrible tyrant of historical memory. The intervention of Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Denmark transformed what should have been a quick victory into a grinding war against multiple enemies with superior resources and technology. As the costs mounted and defeats accumulated, Ivan's suspicions of those around him deepened into paranoid delusions. When Andrei Kurbsky, one of his most successful generals, defected to Poland, Lithuania in 1564, the betrayal shattered Ivan's faith in everyone around him. The operina that Ivan established in response represented a complete break with the careful state-building of his predecessors. Instead of working within the system they had created, Ivan divided his realm into 2 parts and unleashed black-clad enforcers against the very nobility his grandfather had integrated into the service state. Ancient boyar families found themselves scattered, their lands confiscated, their members executed or exiled on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Novgorod, the city his great-grandfather had carefully integrated into the growing Russian state, became the target of Ivan's most savage assault on his own people. Convinced that the city was plotting to defect to Poland, Lithuania, Ivan led his Aratiki on a campaign of systematic destruction that lasted 5 weeks. Entire families were thrown into the icy Vulov River. Archives containing centuries of historical records were burned and churches were looted and desecrated. The city that had been the jewel of northern Russia never fully recovered. The internal terror campaign achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of strengthening Russian resistance to foreign enemies, it devastated precisely those regions that provided the backbone of military power. When the Crimean Tatars exploited this chaos to launch a devastating raid that reached Moscow itself in 1571, burning the capital and carrying off tens of thousands into slavery. Ivan's military prestige lay in ruins alongside his political system. The Tsar, who had begun his reign as a reforming monarch dedicated to building a strong and rational state, died in 1584 as a broken man, leaving the throne to his surviving son. Fodor, this pious but weak ruler, was wholly unsuited for the demands of autocratic government, and his death in 1598 ended the ancient line of Rurik that had ruled the Russian lands for 7 centuries. Boris Godunov, the boyar who seized the throne after Theodor's death, possessed intelligence and administrative skill, but he lacked the mystical legitimacy that only bloodline could provide in the minds of the people. When catastrophic famines struck in the early years of the 17th century, killing perhaps a third of the population, many saw divine punishment for the usurpation of God's anointed ruler. Into this crisis stepped the first false Dmitri, a mysterious figure claiming to be Ivan's murdered youngest son. Whether he truly believed his own story or was simply an ambitious adventurer mattered less than the hope he offered to a desperate people. With Polish backing, his invasions swept away Gordonov's forces and brought him briefly to the throne, only to fall to another boy conspiracy within a year. What followed was a cascade of pretenders, each gathering supporters among those who preferred any alternative to the chaos engulfing their homeland. Polish armies occupied Moscow, while Swedish forces seized the northwest. Kazakh bands ravaged the countryside, while local warlords carved out their own domains. The unified state that Ivan III had built and Ivan IV had nearly destroyed seemed destined to fragment forever. Yet the very depth of the crisis produced its own solution. Faced with foreign occupation and social collapse, Orthodox believers across the land rallied behind a liberation movement that transcended local loyalties. The Monastery of Trinity, St. Sergius, besieged by Polish forces for 16 months, became a symbol of resistance that inspired a national awakening. When the Liberation Army formed around Prince Fai and the merchant, Minan finally drove the Poles from the Kremlin in 1612. It had forged a new conception of collective identity that would outlast any individual ruler. The Assembly of the Land that convened in early 1613 faced the monumental task of selecting a new dynasty. After weeks of deliberation, representatives from across the realm chose 16-year-old Michael Romanov, whose principal qualification was his family's connection to the old dynasty through marriage. It was a choice that prioritized legitimacy and stability over strength and experience. Exactly what the traumatized nation needed. The transformation was complete. The scattered medieval principalities that Ivan III had united through patience and cunning had survived the greatest test any state could face. The service state, the centralized administration, and the concept of Moscow as the Third Rome had all proven strong enough to endure even the chaos of the time of troubles. The question that remained was whether the new dynasty could build upon this foundation to create not just a unified state, but a true empire that could stand among the great powers of the world. Michael Romang's election marked not the end of Russia's crisis, but the beginning of its most ambitious transformation. The 16-year-old who accepted the crown in 1613 inherited a realm devastated by 15 years of civil war, foreign occupation, and social collapse. Entire provinces lay depopulated. The treasury was empty, and the very concept of centralized authority had been shattered by the chaos of the time of troubles. Yet from this apparent ruin would emerge an empire that would dominate European affairs for centuries. The early Romanov years were dominated by the patient work of reconstruction under the guidance of Patriarch Ferret, Michael's formidable father, who had survived Polish captivity to become the real power behind the throne. Where the time of troubles had revealed the weaknesses in Ivan the Terrible's system, the new dynasty would systematically address each vulnerability. Administrative machinery that had collapsed was rebuilt and expanded with professional secretaries, replacing boyar appointees who had treated government service as personal privilege. Military organization received particular attention as the new rulers recognized that survival depended on effective defense against the enemies who still threatened Russian independence. The traditional noble militia that had failed so catastrophically during the Troubles was supplemented by new formation. Regiments trained according to European standards. Foreign officers recruited from war-torn Germany brought professional expertise that transformed amateur levies into disciplined soldiers, capable of standing against Polish cavalry and Swedish infantry. Economic recovery proceeded more slowly but followed the same methodical approach that characterized all early Roman policies. The government established monopolies over key commodities like salt and liquor that provided reliable revenue streams, while new trade regulations encouraged domestic production. The gradual restoration of agricultural productivity in devastated regions required decades. But by Michael's death, the population and prosperity had exceeded pre-Troubles levels. Yet even as Russia recovered its strength, the question of its ultimate goals remained unanswered. Michael's son, Alexis, who ascended the throne in 1645, possessed a more confident personality than his cautious father, and came of age in a realm that had largely healed from its wounds, where Michael had been content to restore what had been lost. Alexis began to contemplate expanding beyond the frontiers his predecessors had established. The Great Cossack Uprising, led by Baden Khmelnytsky, in Ukraine provided the opportunity that would define Alexis's reign and Russia's future. The Cossacks, Orthodox believers who had chafed under Polish Catholic rule, offered their allegiance to the Tsar in 1654 in exchange for protection against their former masters. Alexis's decision to accept this offer, despite knowing it meant permanent war with Poland, Lithuania, marked Russia's transformation from a recovering regional power into an expansionist empire. The 13 Years' War that followed demonstrated both the proactiveness of the military reforms and the continued limitations of Russian power. Initially, successful campaigns saw Russian forces recapture Smolensk and advance deep into Lithuania, with the capture of Vilnius seeming to herald the complete destruction of Polish power in Eastern Europe. Yet the intervention of Sweden, which invaded Poland while Russian armies were advancing westward, complicated what should have been a straightforward conflict. Charles X of Sweden's invasion of Poland transformed a bilateral war into a complex European struggle that revealed Russia's continued vulnerability to the shifting alliances of more experienced diplomatic powers. When Polish and Swedish forces began cooperating against their common Russian enemy, Alexis found himself fighting the kind of coalition warfare that would plague Russian expansion for centuries to come. The Treaty of Andrusovo in 1667 concluded this exhausting conflict with gains that were both substantial and limited. Poland ceded Kiev and all Ukrainian territories east of the Dnieper to Russia, bringing millions of Orthodox believers under the Tsar's protection for the first time since the Mongol conquest. Yet the western territories that had seemed within Russia's grasp remained under Polish control, while the war's enormous costs had strained the empire's resources to their limits. More significantly, the Ukrainian acquisition introduced problems that would challenge Russian rulers for generations. The CSACs, who had sought Russian protection, proved as resistant to Moscow's authority as they had been to Polish control. Their traditions of elected leadership and military democracy conflicted fundamentally with Russian autocracy, creating tensions that would explode into repeated rebellions throughout the coming centuries. Religious reform under Patriarch Nikon added another source of internal division during Alexis's reign. Nikon's corrections to liturgical texts and ritual practices, aimed at bringing Russian Orthodoxy into conformity with Greek standards, split the Church and triggered the schism that created the Old Believer movement. The violent suppression of religious dissent, including the 8-year siege of the Salvetsky Monastery, demonstrated the regime's determination to enforce uniformity of belief alongside political obedience. The death of Alexis in 1676 precipitated a succession crisis that revealed how fragile the Romanov achievement remained. His eldest son, Theodore II, ruled for 6 years before dying childless, leaving the throne disputed between his half-brothers, the sickly Ivan and the vigorous Peter, whose claims were championed by different boy factions. The Steltsy Revolt of 1682 resolved this crisis through violence, forcing the recognition of both brothers as codes under the regency of their sister Sophia. Sophia's regency from 1682 to 1689 represented the last serious attempt to govern Russia according to traditional Muscovite principles. Intelligent and capable, she surrounded herself with advisors who shared her preference for gradual reform within established frameworks, rather than the radical transformation that her younger brother would later impose. Her government's unsuccessful Crimean campaigns, led by Prince Vasily Gulitin, demonstrated the military limitations of the traditional system while providing ammunition for her opponents. Peter's coup in August 1689 ended the regency and marked the beginning of the most revolutionary period in Russian history. Still only 17 years old, the young Kotsar possessed an energy and curiosity that would transform not only his country but the entire balance of power in Europe. His early experiences in the foreign quarter of Moscow had given him a fascination with Western technology and methods that would drive his lifelong campaign to modernize Russia. The Azov campaigns of 1695 and 1696 provided Peter's first taste of serious military command, while revealing both his limitations and his extraordinary capacity for learning from failure. The initial assault on the Ottoman fortress at the mouth of the Don River failed disastrously, demonstrating the inadequacy of traditional Russian siege methods against modern fortifications. Rather than accepting defeat, Peter spent the winter building a fleet on the Don and returned the following year with both naval and land forces, achieving the victory that had eluded him before. This success against the Ottomans was only a prelude to Peter's most audacious undertaking. The Great Embassy of 1697 to 1698, the most extraordinary diplomatic mission in European history. No reigning monarch had ever traveled abroad incognito to study foreign methods. But Peter spent 18 months touring the courts and workshops of Europe, working as a common shipwright in Dutch yards, studying artillery techniques in Prussia, and observing parliamentary debates in England. He absorbed lessons that would reshape his homeland. The Strezzi revolt that erupted during Peter's absence forced his premature return, and provided the pretext for the violent dismantling of traditional institutions. The palace guards, who had dominated Moscow for over a century, were systematically destroyed through mass executions. Their units disbanded, and their families scattered. Peter's personal participation in the executions sent an unmistakable message that the old Muscovite system was dead and would not be permitted to resurrect itself. The Great Northern War that began in 1700 would dominate the next 2 decades and complete Russia's transformation from regional power to European empire. Peter's alliance with Denmark and Poland against Sweden seemed to promise easy victories against the young Charles XII, but the devastating defeat at Narva in November 1700 shattered these illusions. Peter's new model army, caught unprepared by Swedish tactical superiority, suffered losses so severe that foreign observers wrote off his military ambitions entirely. Yet this humiliating defeat became the catalyst for the most comprehensive military revolution in Russian history. Peter abandoned all attempts to reform existing institutions and instead built an entirely new military system from the ground up. Universal conscription replaced traditional noble levies, creating a permanent standing army of unprecedented size. Foreign officers were recruited by the hundreds to train and lead the new regiments, while artillery and engineering schools produced the technical specialists that modern warfare required. The industrial transformation needed to support this military revolution was equally dramatic. New ironworks in the Urals utilized the latest European technology to produce cannon and muskets in quantities that dwarfed traditional production. Textile mills supplied uniforms for the expanding forces, while shipyards on Lake Loga and later on the Baltic coast built the fleet that would challenge Swedish naval supremacy in northern waters. Administrative reform accompanied military modernization as Peter swept away the ancient institutions that had governed Russia since medieval times. The Boyar Council that had advised tsars for centuries was abolished and replaced by a Senate modeled on European institutions. Professional colleges took over specific administrative functions, while the table of ranks established a meritocratic system that allowed talented commoners to rise through government service based on ability rather than birth. The foundation of St. Petersburg in 1703 symbolized Peter's complete break with the Muscovite past. Built on marshy islands in the Neva Delta, where thousands of workers died from disease and exhaustion, the new city represented a conscious rejection of traditional Russian architectural styles and urban planning. European architects designed palaces and public buildings according to the latest Western fashions, creating Peter's window on Europe through sheer force of will and enormous human sacrifice. The Battle of Pava in 1709 marked the decisive turning point in both the Northern War and European power politics. Charles I-12's invasion of Ukraine intended to knock Russia out of the anti-Swedish coalition, instead led the Swedish king into a trap that destroyed his army and ended Swedish dreams of Baltic Empire. Peter's forces, now professionally trained and equipped with modern weapons, demonstrated their superiority over what had been considered Europe's finest military machine. This victory resonated across Europe like a thunderclap, forcing diplomats who had dismissed Russia as a barbarous frontier state to recognize it as a major power. The subsequent Russian advance into Sweden's Baltic territories and the occupation of Finland demonstrated that Peter's military revolution had created not just defensive capabilities, but the capacity to project force throughout Northern Europe. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721, which finally ended the Great Northern War, confirmed Swedish cession of the entire Baltic coastline from Viborg to Riga. Peter had achieved his window on Europe, while gaining recognition as one of the continent's great powers. The imperial title he assumed that same year reflected this new status. No longer content to be called Tsar, he became emperor and autocrat of all the Rus. The transformation of Russian society proceeded alongside these political and military changes through reforms that touched every aspect of daily life. The table of ranks created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility based on merit rather than birth, while compulsory education for noble children introduced Western subjects that previous generations had considered unnecessary or dangerous. The adoption of European dress codes and social customs marked the visible break with Muscovite traditions. Religious policy under Peter represented perhaps the most radical departure from previous practice. The Patriarchate, which had provided spiritual authority independent of royal control, since the 16th century was abolished in 1721 and replaced by the Holy Sind, essentially a government department headed by a lay official. Orthodox Christianity remained the official faith, but the Church became a branch of the imperial administration rather than an independent institution. Economic development followed mercantilist principles popular throughout contemporary Europe, with state-sponsored manufacturing aimed at reducing dependence on foreign imports while developing export industries. The textile, metallurgical, and armament sectors expanded dramatically under government protection and subsidy, while trade with Europe increased enormously as Baltic ports opened new commercial opportunities that had been blocked during the Swedish period. Cultural transformation accompanied these material changes as Peter's reign witnessed the beginning of modern Russian intellectual life. The Academy of Sciences, established in 1724, brought European scholars to the imperial capital to advance learning in mathematics, natural philosophy, and other modern disciplines. The first Russian newspaper began publication, spreading news and imperial decrees throughout the realm, while secular literature and theatre challenged the Church's traditional monopoly on cultural expression. Yet the human cost of Peter's rapid transformation was enormous, creating resentments and tensions that would plague his successors. Peasant rebellions erupted repeatedly as tax burdens increased to fund military campaigns and construction projects. The Balvan revolt in the Dawn region required major military expeditions to suppress, while noble families that had dominated political life for generations found themselves marginalized or destroyed by the new meritocratic system. Opposition to Peter's reforms took various forms, from open rebellion to passive resistance to religious dissent. The Old Believers who rejected not only Nikon's religious innovations, but Peter's entire westernizing program suffered systematic persecution that drove them to remote regions where they maintained their traditional practices in secret. Even Peter's own son, Alexis, heir to the throne, was tortured to death for allegedly plotting against the reforms. The Pruth campaign of 1711 demonstrated that even Peter's reformed military system had limitations when facing experienced opponents on unfavorable terrain. His invasion of Ottoman territory, intended to support Orthodox Christians in the Balkans, ended in disaster when Turkish forces trapped the Russian army on the Pruth River. Only skillful diplomacy and enormous bribes secured the army's escape, though at the cost of returning Azov and abandoning plans for Black Sea expansion. Despite such setbacks, Peter's later years saw the consolidation of his achievements through institutional development that would outlast his personal rule. Provincial administration was reorganized to provide more effective control over vast territories, while educational reforms created the foundation for long-term cultural transformation. The School of Mathematics and Navigation, established in 1701, trained the specialists, essential for military and maritime development. Foreign relations during Peter's final years consolidated the gains achieved through military victory, while establishing Russia as a permanent factor in European diplomacy. Dynastic marriages linked the imperial family to European royal houses, while commercial treaties opened new markets for Russian exports and secured access to Western technology and expertise. Peter's death in January 1725 left an empire transformed beyond recognition, but also dangerously dependent on his personal authority. The scattered principalities that earlier tsars had united into a single realm had become the largest contiguous state in the world, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. The medieval Muscovite system had given way to modern imperial institutions, while the Orthodox realm had become a European power capable of influencing continental politics. Yet fundamental contradictions within Peter's system remained unresolved, creating problems that would challenge his successors for generations. An autocratic political structure sat uneasily with the meritocratic ideals embodied in the table of ranks, while orthodox religious tradition conflicted with secular Western culture. Most dangerously, Peter had failed to establish clear succession laws, leaving the throne disputed between different branches of the imperial family, who represented fundamentally different approaches to governance and foreign policy. The immediate succession crisis that followed Peter's death would test whether the institutions he had created could survive without his driving personality to hold them together. The question facing Russia's future rulers was whether they could preserve the essence of Peter's achievement while adapting to changing circumstances, or whether the internal tensions he had managed through force of will eventually tear apart the empire he had built. Peter the Great's death in January 1725 left behind an empire transformed but precariously balanced, its vast machinery dependent on the driving will of one extraordinary individual. The succession crisis that immediately erupted would define the next 4 decades, as different factions struggled not merely for power, but for the soul of the new Russia Peter had created. The question was whether his revolutionary changes would survive, evolve, or be swept away by those who had never accepted them. Catherine I, Peter's widow and chosen successor, possessed neither the intellect nor the energy to govern the empire her husband had built. Real power fell to the Supreme Privy Council, dominated by old noble families who had waited decades for their opportunity to reverse Peter's most radical innovations. When Catherine died after ruling for only 2 years, these aristocrats saw their chance to restore the traditional order they believed had been wrongfully destroyed. Their selection of young Peter II seemed to offer the perfect opportunity for counter-revolution. The boy emperor's brief reign from 1727 to 1730 witnessed systematic attempts to roll back Peter the Great's reforms while restoring the influence of ancient Boer families. The court moved back to Moscow, abandoning St. Petersburg as an expensive symbol of foreign contamination, while Western advisors found themselves replaced by men whose families had governed Russia for centuries. Yet when Peter II died suddenly in 1730, the Supreme Privy Council overreached in their moment of apparent triumph. The conditions they presented to Anna, their chosen successor, would have transformed Russia into a constitutional monarchy where the empress could not marry, declare war, make peace, impose taxes, or control the military without noble consent. For a brief moment, it seemed that autocracy itself might be abandoned. For a system that resembled the limited monarchies emerging elsewhere in Europe, Anna's apparent submission to these restrictions masked a cunning, political intelligence that her controllers had fatally underestimated. Once established in St. Petersburg, for she had immediately returned the capital to Peter's city, she skillfully gathered support from the lesser nobility and officer corps who had prospered under the previous regime. At a dramatic ceremony before the assembled court, she tore up the conditions and declared herself absolute ruler, ending the constitutional experiment after exactly 37 days. The decade that followed became known as the German Terror, as Anna relied heavily on foreign advisors, particularly her favorite Ernst Byron, to govern the empire. The systematic persecution of those who had supported constitutional limitations served notice that autocracy would defend itself with whatever force proved necessary. Yet beneath this surface reaction, the essential framework of Peter's state remained intact, proving more durable than either its supporters or opponents had imagined. Anna's reign also witnessed the resumption of territorial expansion as the reformed military demonstrated its continued effectiveness despite political turmoil. The war against the Ottoman Empire that began in 1735 saw Russian forces advance deep into the Balkans, while the Baltic fleet projected power into the Mediterranean for the first time since Peter's reign. These victories confirmed that military modernization had created permanent capabilities rather than temporary advantages dependent on Peter's personal leadership. When Anna died childless in 1740, the succession crisis that followed brought Elizabeth to power through a palace coup that would define the next phase of imperial development. The daughter of Peter the Great herself, Elizabeth possessed both the legitimacy of bloodline and the political skill to navigate the competing factions that had paralyzed her predecessors. Her dramatic seizure of power leading guards through the winter streets of St. Petersburg, announced a return to the policies and spirit of her father's reign. Elizabeth's 20-year rule marked a conscious synthesis of Peter's innovations with traditional Russian culture, creating a distinctly national approach to European civilization, where Peter had often seemed to reject Russian traditions entirely. Elizabeth demonstrated that modernization could proceed without abandoning the Orthodox faith and Slavic customs that defined the empire's identity. Her court became renowned throughout Europe for its magnificence, while maintaining its distinctly Russian character. The cultural flowering that occurred during Elizabeth's reign established Russia as a European center of learning and artistic achievement. The University of Moscow, founded in 1755, became the empire's first institution of higher learning, while the expansion of secondary education created the educated class that effective governance required. Literature and theatre began to develop as secular art forms, though careful government supervision ensured that creative expression served imperial purposes. Military success accompanied cultural achievement as the 7 Years' War demonstrated Russia's emergence as a decisive factor in European power politics. Frederick the Great of Prussia, perhaps Europe's most formidable military commander, found himself repeatedly defeated by armies that foreign observers had previously dismissed as undisciplined barbarians. The Russian occupation of Berlin in 1760 sent shockwaves through European capitals, proving that the Northern Empire could project force into the heart of the continent. Elizabeth's diplomatic achievements proved equally significant in establishing Russia's permanent place in the European balance of power. The alliance with Austria and France that emerged during the 7 Years' War marked what historians call the diplomatic revolution, aligning Russia with the traditional European powers against the rising influence of Prussia and Britain. This integration into European politics as an equal partner rather than a peripheral player would remain a cornerstone of imperial foreign policy for generations. Yet Elizabeth's greatest achievement may have been her careful preparation for the succession that had destabilized every previous reign. Her choice of her nephew Peter as heir seemed to promise continuity, while his marriage to the German princess who would become Catherine the Great appeared to secure the dynasty's future. What Elizabeth could not foresee was that Peter III would prove spectacularly unsuited for imperial rule, possessing neither his aunt's political intelligence nor his great-grandfather's sense of Russian interests. Peter III's brief reign in 1762 demonstrated how quickly effective leadership could be squandered. Through incompetence and misguided policies, his decision to abandon the successful war against Prussia, just as Russian victory seemed certain, outraged both the military and the general population. His attacks on the Orthodox Church, his attempts to impose Prussian military discipline on Russian guards, regiments, and his apparent plans to lead a war against Denmark to recover his Holstein patrimony alienated every major constituency in the empire. The conspiracy that formed around Peter's wife, Catherine, represented more than personal ambition. It was a movement to preserve the essential character of the modernized empire against a ruler who seemed determined to destroy everything his predecessors had built. Catherine's German birth might have seemed a disadvantage, but her 18 years at the Russian court had convinced both elites and common people of her genuine devotion to her adopted homeland and its interests. The coup that brought Catherine to power in June 1762 unfolded with remarkable ease, demonstrating the complete collapse of Peter III's authority. While the deposed emperor vacillated at his palace outside the capital, Catherine rode through St. Petersburg in imperial regalia, receiving the acclamation of guards and civilians alike. Within days, Peter was dead under mysterious circumstances, and Catherine faced the challenge of proving herself worthy of the throne she had seized. The early years of Catherine's reign were devoted to establishing her legitimacy through policies that demonstrated both competence and vision. Unlike previous rulers who had relied primarily on force and tradition, she sought to base her authority on rational principles derived from Enlightenment philosophy. Her extensive correspondence with Voltaire, Diderot, and other leading thinkers of the age established her reputation as an enlightened monarch throughout Europe. The Nakas, or instruction, that Catherine composed for legal reform represented the most systematic attempt to apply Enlightenment principles to governance that had yet been seen. Drawing heavily on the works of Montesquieu and Descartes, this comprehensive document outlined reforms of the legal system, criminal justice, and administrative procedures that would have transformed Russia into something resembling the rational states that philosophers envisioned. Though never fully implemented, the Nakas demonstrated Catherine's intellectual ambitions while establishing her credentials as a progressive ruler. The Legislative Commission that Catherine convened in 1767 marked an unprecedented experiment in representative government within the autocratic system. Delegates from across the empire, nobles, merchants, state peasants, even some Cossacks gathered in Moscow to consider fundamental reforms of law and administration. While the commission ultimately failed to produce concrete legislation, it provided Catherine with invaluable insight into the conditions and desires of her subjects, while demonstrating her commitment to governing according to rational principles rather than arbitrary will. Yet Catherine's enlightened principles faced their greatest test when Pugachev's rebellion erupted in 1773, revealing the fundamental contradictions at the heart of her rule. The Cossack, who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, gathered a massive following among the dispossessed throughout the Volga region, promising freedom from serfdom, relief from taxation, and revenge against the nobility. The uprising scale and ferocity demonstrated how completely the benefits of enlightened government had failed to reach the masses of the population. The brutal suppression of Pugachev's revolt, culminating in the pretender's execution in Red Square, marked a decisive turning point in Catherine's domestic policies. The experience convinced her that reform must proceed cautiously within existing social structures rather than challenging the fundamental arrangements that maintain stability. The provincial reform that followed created more effective local administration while strengthening noble control over their serfs rather than preparing for eventual emancipation. Catherine's foreign policy achievements more than compensated for the limitations of domestic reform, as two successful wars against the Ottoman Empire established Russia as the dominant power in Eastern Europe. The First Turkish War, beginning in 1768, saw Russian armies advance to the Danube, while the Baltic fleet sailed around Europe to destroy Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. These unprecedented victories demonstrated that military modernization had created capabilities that previous generations could barely have imagined. The Treaty of Kachak-Kanagi in 1774 concluded the First Turkish War with gains that exceeded Catherine's most optimistic expectations. The Crimean Peninsula gained independence from Ottoman suzerainty as the first step toward eventual Russian annexation, while Russia received navigation rights throughout Ottoman waters and the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Sultan's domains. These privileges would provide pretexts for future expansion while establishing Russia as the protector of Orthodox believers throughout the Ottoman Empire. The annexation of Crimea in 1783 represented the culmination of centuries of struggle against the Tatar successor states that had terrorized Russian lands since the Mongol conquest. Pushkin's administration of the peninsula demonstrated the empire's capacity for integrating diverse populations while developing new territories according to rational principles. The construction of Sevastopol as a naval base gave Russia permanent power projection capabilities in the Black Sea, fulfilling ancient dreams of warm water access. Catherine's most ambitious diplomatic scheme, the Greek project, envisioned nothing less than the restoration of the Byzantine Empire under Russian protection. While this grandiose plan was never realized, it demonstrated the scope of imperial ambitions and the confidence that military success had generated. The prospect of Russian forces marching into Constantinople alarmed every major European power, leading to the formation of new coalitions designed to contain further expansion. The Second Turkish War, beginning in 1787, tested these expanded ambitions. Against a reformed Ottoman military backed by European allies. Though initial Russian advances proved slower than in the previous conflict, the same commanders who had achieved earlier victories eventually prevailed through superior organization and determination. The storming of Izmail in 1790, where Suvorov's forces captured what was considered an impregnable fortress, demonstrated that Russian military superiority remained intact despite Ottoman improvements. Polish policy during Catherine's reign completed the transformation of Eastern European power relationships through the systematic destruction of what had once been Russia's most dangerous rival. The three partitions of Poland between 1772 and 1795 eliminated. This ancient kingdom, entirely with Russian forces occupying territories that had contested imperial expansion for centuries. The acquisition of Lithuania, Brass, and eastern Poland brought millions of new subjects under imperial rule while extending the empire's borders deep into the heart of Europe. The management of these vast territorial acquisitions demonstrated Catherine's genius for imperial administration on an unprecedented scale. Rather than attempting to Russify conquered populations immediately, she pursued policies of gradual integration that preserved local institutions while ensuring central control. This enlightened approach to governing diverse peoples helped minimize resistance while maximizing the benefits of expansion, creating a model for imperial administration that would influence European colonial policies for generations. Cultural achievements during Catherine's reign rivaled territorial gains in their significance for Russia's long-term development. The Hermitage collection, begun as Catherine's private passion for art and learning, grew into one of Europe's greatest repositories of human culture. Russian literature began to develop its distinctive voice through writers like Deribin, whose poetry celebrated both imperial grandeur and individual dignity within the framework of enlightened absolutism. The development of Russian historical consciousness accompanied this cultural flowering as scholars began to place their nation's achievements within the broader context of European civilization. Catherine herself contributed to this intellectual development through historical writings that portrayed Russia as the heir to Byzantine greatness while embracing Western Enlightenment. The emergence of a distinctly Russian literary and intellectual tradition provided cultural foundations for imperial identity that complemented military and political achievements. Scientific advancement flourished under imperial patronage as the Academy of Sciences expanded its activities throughout the empire's vast territories. Expeditions mapped regions from the Arctic Ocean to the Pacific coast while cataloging the natural resources that would fuel future development. The voyages of exploration that reached Alaska and established Russian settlements along the North American coast demonstrated that imperial influence now extended to distant shores that earlier generations could never have imagined reaching. Economic development during Catherine's reign provided the material foundation for cultural and military achievements, while revealing the limitations that continued to constrain imperial ambitions. Agricultural expansion in newly acquired territories increased grain exports dramatically, providing revenue for military campaigns and cultural projects. Manufacturing establishments, though still limited compared to Western Europe, began to supply domestic needs while reducing dependence on foreign imports that drained the imperial treasury. Yet, the fundamental contradiction between enlightened principles and social reality remained unresolved throughout Catherine's reign. While she corresponded with philosophers about human rights and dignity, she presided over the expansion of serfdom into territories where it had not previously existed. The charter to the nobility enhanced aristocratic privileges while doing nothing to ameliorate the condition of the bonded peasantry, who comprised the vast majority of the population. The peasant question haunted Catherine's reign and would plague her successors for generations to come. Her private correspondence reveals genuine concern about the morality of serfdom, yet practical considerations always prevented meaningful reform. The economic and social foundations of the empire seemed to require the continuation of bondage. Regardless of Enlightenment principles that proclaimed the natural equality of all human beings. When Catherine died in November 1796, she left behind an empire that had achieved unprecedented territorial extent and cultural sophistication. Over the course of 34 years, she had added more territory than any ruler since Ivan the Great, extending imperial borders from the Baltic to the Black Sea, while projecting Russian influence from Poland to Alaska. The institutions she had created or reformed provided the administrative framework for governing this vast domain, while the cultural achievements of her reign established Russia's reputation as a European center of learning and artistic creation. Yet the fundamental tensions within the system remained as dangerous as ever, perhaps more so because of the expectations that enlightened government had raised among educated Russians. The gap between rational principles and autocratic practice, between cultural sophistication and social backwardness, between territorial expansion and economic development would test the abilities of Catherine's successors as they struggled to maintain the empire she had built while adapting to the revolutionary changes that were already beginning to transform the European world. Whispers of patricide and fears of revolutionary contagion surrounded Paul I as he ascended the throne that his mother had occupied for 34 transformative years. 42 years of waiting in the shadows had twisted his character, nursing grievances until they consumed his judgment entirely. Rather than building upon Catherine's achievements, he launched a systematic campaign to destroy everything she had created, setting in motion a cycle of reaction and counter-reaction that would define the empire's tortured relationship with modernity for the next 6 decades. Officers who had basked in imperial favor suddenly found themselves exiled to remote provinces, their confusion and resentment creating the first cracks in military loyalty upon which autocracy depended. Policies that had defined the previous era vanished overnight, yet each reversal created new problems that demanded further intervention. Prussian drill replaced the relatively relaxed discipline that had characterized the Guards regiments. But this militarization only highlighted the growing gap between autocratic theory and practical administration. Perpetual anxiety gripped the palace as courtiers attempted to navigate the ruler's unpredictable moods, poisoning the foundations of effective governance. Foreign policy underwent equally dramatic transformation when Paul abandoned the coalition against revolutionary France, developing instead an admiration for Bonaparte's authoritarian methods. This diplomatic revolution confused allies, emboldened enemies, and demonstrated how quickly centuries of careful relationship building could be destroyed by imperial caprice. Conspiracy became inevitable. Leading officials, including the governor of St. Petersburg himself, plotted against a ruler who had made rational administration impossible. More than personal grievance drove their actions. This was a revolt by the entire governing class against arbitrary tyranny. Paul's son knew of the plot, though whether he authorized his father's murder remains disputed. Yet this knowledge would burden his conscience throughout his coming reign. Alexander I inherited both a throne and a terrible secret when the March 1801 palace coup brought him to power. Swiss tutors had filled his mind with Enlightenment ideals about benevolent rule and gradual liberation. Yet he governed a realm built on absolute authority and human bondage. This fundamental contradiction between enlightened principles and autocratic reality would drive every aspect of his 24-year reign, leading him toward reforms. He could never complete an international commitments that would ultimately consume his empire's resources. Mikhail Speransky embodied the young emperor's reformist aspirations. This brilliant administrator drafted comprehensive plans for constitutional monarchy, legal codification, and bureaucratic modernization that would have transformed Russia into something resembling the rational states emerging elsewhere in Europe. Each proposal, however, immediately encountered resistance from entrenched interests, who recognized that rationalization would threaten their privileges. Nobles who had suffered under Paul's arbitrary rule proved equally hostile to Spansk's systematic reforms, creating a political deadlock that would persist throughout the reign. Educational expansion marked the most successful aspect of these domestic initiatives. New universities arose in St. Petersburg, Kazan, Kiev, and Dorpat, joining Moscow's solitary institution. European professors and modern libraries began creating the educated class that rational administration required. Yet they also produced the critical intelligentsia that would eventually challenge the system they were designed to serve. Gymnasiums and parish schools spread throughout the provinces for the first time, introducing literacy to social groups previously excluded from intellectual life. Bonaparte's conquests overshadowed these domestic achievements, shattering the European balance and replacing ancient monarchies with satellite republics. French territorial expansion posed an existential challenge to every remaining independent state, but particularly to Russia, whose vast territories and orthodox faith made it the natural rallying point for European resistance. Alexander emerged as the most consistent opponent of French hegemony. Yet, this role came at enormous cost in both blood and treasure. Coalition warfare characterized the Napoleonic period, but Russia bore a disproportionate burden of resistance, while other powers wavered between resistance and accommodation. Alexander maintained his opposition to Bonaparte's continental system. Despite the economic devastation this stance inflicted upon his subjects, closed European markets devastated the grain trade that provided much of the realm's revenue, forcing the government to resort to paper money and foreign loans that mortgaged the empire's future. Tilsit's meeting on a raft in the middle of the Neman River temporarily ended hostilities between the two sovereigns, but failed to resolve their fundamental incompatibility. Bonaparte's demands for complete commercial isolation from Britain conflicted directly with Russia's economic interests, while French territorial ambitions in Finland and the Ottoman provinces clashed with Russian strategic objectives. Alexander's agreement to these terms reflected his recognition that his empire could not sustain continued warfare. Yet peace was merely a temporary expedient. Rupture came when Bonaparte assembled the largest host in European history for his 1812 invasion. Over 600,000 men drawn from across the French domains crossed the Neman, possessing overwhelming numerical superiority and battle-tested effectiveness. Yet this force's very size created logistical challenges that would prove insurmountable in the vast Russian interior, where geography itself became Russia's most powerful ally. Strategic withdrawal replaced immediate battle as Russian forces retreated deeper into their homeland's interior, stretching French supply lines beyond their breaking point. Scorched earth tactics denied the invaders food and fodder that such a massive host required. This strategy, born of necessity rather than brilliant planning, revealed the defensive advantages that geography provided, while demonstrating the empire's capacity for sacrifice in the face of existential threat. Borodino's savage battle fought within sight of Moscow's spires demonstrated both Russian determination and the hollow nature of Bonaparte's apparent victory, though French forces held the field at day's end. They had suffered irreplaceable casualties, while Russian armies retained their capacity for organized resistance. Russian willingness to fight such a devastating battle, so close to their ancient capital, revealed a depth of commitment that foreign observers had not anticipated. Moscow's burning marked the campaign's climax and Bonaparte's downfall. Whether set ablaze by its own defenders or by accident, the ancient capital's destruction denied the Grand Army the winter quarters it desperately needed, while demonstrating a level of sacrifice that elevated military resistance into religious crusade. Bonaparte found himself master of a city of ashes, while his enemies controlled the surrounding countryside and the moral authority that comes from ultimate commitment to homeland defense. October's retreat became one of history's greatest catastrophes. Harassed by regular forces, Cossack raiders, and partisan bands, the Grand Army disintegrated in the face of an early winter whose severity exceeded all expectations. Fewer than 30,000 effective soldiers recrossed the Niemen from the mighty host that entered 6 months earlier. Europe's most formidable military machine lay destroyed in Russian snows, establishing the empire as the continent's leading power almost overnight. Liberation campaigns followed, with Alexander emerging as the liberator of Europe. Victory thrust responsibilities upon the empire that its domestic institutions were poorly equipped to handle. Congress Poland's acquisition and Finnish annexation expanded the realm's frontiers while incorporating populations with strong national identities and constitutional traditions that sat uneasily within the autocratic system. Constitutional kingdoms within the autocratic state created administrative complexities that would plague future generations. Religious mysticism increasingly consumed Alexander's later years, leading him away from practical reforms toward abstract concerns about divine purpose and personal salvation. Victory over Bonaparte should have provided the confidence needed for domestic transformation. Yet the emperor, who had begun his reign dreaming of constitutional monarchy, ended it preparing for monastic retreat. Conversations with religious enthusiasts and apparent preparations for abandoning worldly concerns suggested complete rejection of governmental responsibilities. Succession crisis erupted when Alexander died unexpectedly in the Crimean city of Taganrog. Confusion over whether Constantine or his younger brother should inherit the throne provided an opportunity for officers influenced by progressive ideas to attempt constitutional revolution. Secret correspondents had assigned succession to the younger brother, while allowing the elder to remain in Poland, creating a leadership vacuum that lasted for weeks. Senate Square became the stage for revolution on a bitter December morning in 1825. Officers refused to swear allegiance to Nicholas, demanding instead constitutional monarchy, legal guarantees, and gradual abolition of serfdom. This first organized challenge to absolute rule from within the educated elite marked the beginning of the revolutionary tradition that would eventually destroy the old order. Division among the conspirators about their goals and methods allowed loyalist forces to suppress the revolt. Without difficulty, Nicholas I ascended the throne, determined to prevent any repetition of the December uprising. But his methods of prevention would create the very conditions that made revolution inevitable. Investigation revealed how deeply progressive ideas had penetrated the officer corps and educated society, shocking a ruler who had assumed that loyalty was natural and permanent. 5 leaders faced execution while hundreds more went into Siberian exile, serving notice that absolute authority would defend itself with whatever force proved necessary. Reaction, repression, and resistance to change became synonymous with the new reign. Administrative centralization reached unprecedented levels under Nicholas's personal supervision. Yet rather than strengthening the state, this obsessive control actually weakened it by preventing the development of capable subordinates. No philosopher or humanitarian, Nicholas viewed himself as a soldier whose duty was to preserve the realm his ancestors had built, regardless of changing circumstances or foreign criticism. Secret police expanded dramatically under the third section, an organization answerable only to the throne that monitored public opinion and suppressed seditious activities with ruthless efficiency. Yet its reports revealed growing discontent that repression could contain but not eliminate. Censorship expanded to cover not just political publications, but literature, theater, and even musical compositions that might contain subversive messages, creating an atmosphere of intellectual suffocation that drove the most talented minds toward opposition. Universities came under strict surveillance as educational. Policy reflected the same suspicious attitude toward intellectual freedom. Officials monitored lectures and student activities for signs of dangerous thinking. Philosophy study was restricted, foreign travel curtailed, and academic appointments subjected to political screening rather than producing competent technicians. These restrictions actually accelerated the development of revolutionary consciousness by convincing educated Russians that their government feared truth itself. Official nationality emerged as the ideological foundation for resistance to change. Education Minister Sergei Uvarov's Trinity of Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality claimed to embody the authentic spirit of the people against foreign contamination. Yet the gap between official rhetoric and social reality became increasingly obvious. This artificial ideology could not compete with the genuine intellectual firmament occurring despite official disapproval. Economic and social changes undermined the old order's foundations, even as political controls tightened. Railway construction revolutionized transportation and communication in ways that no amount of political control could contain. Industrial development began creating new social classes, whose relationship to the means of production differed fundamentally from traditional categories. Manufacturing establishments around Moscow and St. Petersburg brought together large numbers of workers in conditions that fostered collective consciousness. Serfdom itself showed increasing strain as economic changes reduced its efficiency and increased its costs. Estate owners who had once profited from bonded labor found themselves competing with free labor systems that proved more productive and adaptable. Serf sales without land became increasingly common, creating a landless rural proletariat that challenged traditional social categories while generating enormous human suffering. Intellectual flowering continued despite official repression. Pushkin, Lermontov, and Gogol created a distinctly national literature that was nonetheless cosmopolitan in outlook and implicitly critical of existing arrangements. Though avoiding direct political commentary, these writers explored themes of individual dignity and social justice that provided powerful alternatives to official ideology. Philosophical debates between slavels and westernizers dominated educated discourse, containing immediate political implications that both sides understood clearly. Foreign interventions revealed the growing costs of defending conservative order throughout Europe. Hungarian revolutions, suppression demonstrated the realm's role as defender of legitimacy. against popular movements but established dangerous precedents for involvement in other nations' internal affairs. Support for the Ottoman Empire against Egyptian independence movements showed consistent opposition to change while draining resources desperately needed for domestic development. Eastern question diplomacy became entangled with religious and cultural concerns that made rational calculation nearly impossible. Nicholas viewed himself as the natural protector of Orthodox Christians within the Sultan's domains, a role that brought the realm into conflict with other powers who feared excessive Russian expansion. Strategic interest, combined with religious mission, created a volatile mixture that would eventually explode into destructive warfare. Crimean conflict erupted in 1853 from disputes over Christian holy places in Jerusalem, but quickly escalated into general confrontation between Russia and a European coalition. Nicholas apparently believed that Britain and France would not unite effectively against him, while Austria and Prussia would support conservative solidarity. These miscalculations reflected the isolation that 30 years of repressive rule had created, cutting the autocrat off from accurate information about international realities. Sevastopol's siege exposed every weakness in the system Nicholas had built. Fortress walls that had symbolized naval power in the Black Sea fell after a year-long siege that demonstrated European technological and organizational superiority over Russian courage and determination. Disparity in equipment, communication, and medical care showed that the empire had fallen dangerously behind its rivals, despite decades of apparent stability. Nicholas died during the siege, removing the ruler who had most completely embodied resistance to change. His son inherited not only a losing conflict, but also a structure that had proved incapable of defending previous generations' achievements. Paris Treaty terms imposed harsh conditions that effectively eliminated Russia as a Black Sea naval force. But strategic humiliation mattered less than the psychological impact on educated opinion. Serf soldiers who had fought with legendary courage despite inadequate equipment became symbols of the realm's untapped potential while raising uncomfortable questions about a system that demanded such sacrifice from those it denied basic human rights. Their heroism in defense of a structure that kept them in bondage created moral pressure for emancipation that even conservative officials could no longer ignore. Crimean catastrophe marked not just the end of Nicholas's reign, but the collapse of the entire system he had created to resist change. 30 years of repression had produced not strength, but dangerous weakness that foreign enemies could exploit and domestic critics could no longer ignore. Fundamental assumptions about governance that had seemed permanent now required complete reconsideration. Crisis could no longer be postponed, setting the stage for the most dramatic transformation since the empire's founding. Sevastopol's fall echoed across an empire that had believed itself invincible. Alexander II inherited not merely a lost war, but a shattered system whose fundamental inadequacies had been exposed before the watching world. Unlike his granite-willed father or mystically inclined uncle, this new sovereign possessed neither unshakable certainty nor otherworldly visions. What he did have was the terrible clarity that comes from catastrophic defeat. The old methods had failed completely, and transformation could no longer be postponed. Educated society, long silenced by censorship and surveillance, now spoke openly of the need for fundamental change. Serf soldiers who had died by the thousands for a system that denied them basic humanity became powerful symbols of injustice that even conservative officials could not ignore. Foreign observers had witnessed technological superiority triumph over Russian courage, making continued isolation from European progress impossible. Every assumption about governance, society, and development that had seemed permanent only months before now demanded complete reconsideration. Emancipation dominated all other considerations. Yet the complexities of liberation defied simple solutions. 23 million souls remained the legal property of their masters, bought and sold like livestock, subject to corporal punishment and Siberian exile at their owner's whim. This institution, which had once seemed as permanent as the seasons, now appeared as an intolerable burden on the nation's conscience and development. But how could such vast numbers be granted liberty without destroying the economy that depended on their labor? Committees grappled with questions that had no precedent in human history. What compensation, if any, should former masters receive for their lost human property? How much land should accompany personal emancipation? And how should former bondsmen pay for their allotments? Some desired immediate and complete abolition. Others feared economic ruin, while bureaucrats worried about social chaos that might destroy the state itself. Alexander wavered between humanitarian impulses and practical concerns, seeking a middle path that would satisfy competing demands while preserving stability. Years of debate produced a compromise that pleased no one completely, but avoided the extremes that might have torn the realm apart. February 19, 1861, brought the manifesto that proclaimed emancipation. Bondsmen gained personal liberty and the right to own property, marry without permission, and engage in commerce. Never again could they be bought, sold, or subjected to arbitrary punishment by their former masters. Yet liberty came with crushing limitations that would poison rural life for generations. Former bondsmen received land allotments, but these were generally smaller and less fertile than the plots they had previously worked. Redemption payments to the state would continue for 49 years to compensate former owners, keeping peasants tied to their villages and subject to collective responsibility for taxes and obligations. Many rural laborers had expected complete liberation and generous land grants, not the complicated arrangements that actually emerged. Uprisings erupted in several provinces as former bondsmen protested the terms of their release. Besna became a symbol of dashed hopes when troops fired on peasants who refused to accept what they considered false freedom. The most serious disturbances required military force to suppress, casting a shadow over what should have been a moment of national celebration, rather than gratitude. Emancipation produced confusion and resentment that would fuel revolutionary movements for decades to come. Liberation's incomplete nature created new problems, even as it solved old ones. Former masters found themselves without labor while lacking the capital needed for agricultural improvement. Peasants discovered that legal freedom meant little without economic independence or adequate land. Both groups turned to the state for solutions that overstretched bureaucracy could not provide, creating administrative chaos that spread throughout the empire's rural heartland. Judicial transformation accompanied social liberation as Alexander recognized that emancipation required legal protection for the newly freed. Ancient courts based on social privilege and bureaucratic caprice gave way to institutions modeled on European practice. All citizens gained the right to trial by jury, legal representation, and public proceedings regardless of their social status or personal connections. Judges received security of tenure and adequate salaries to ensure their independence from administrative pressure. Public confidence in these new courts grew quickly as fair and efficient procedures replaced the arbitrary justice that had characterized the old system. For the first time, ordinary citizens could expect equitable treatment in legal disputes, while the emerging legal profession produced eloquent advocates who challenged official abuses and defended individual rights. Yet this very success created new tensions as judicial independence conflicted with autocratic tradition. Zemstvos expanded local self-governance through elected assemblies responsible for schooling, healthcare, roads, and other public services. Though limited in authority and dominated by noble landowners, these institutions provided the first systematic training in democratic procedures that Russian society had ever experienced. Different social classes learned to cooperate for common purposes, creating a civic culture that had never existed under pure autocracy. Yet XDOO independence immediately conflicted with central control. Provincial governors viewed these elected bodies with suspicion, while St. Petersburg bureaucrats resented any limitation on their authority. Each exo success in improving local conditions raised uncomfortable questions about why similar improvements could not be achieved at the national level. Local self-governance became a school for political participation that autocracy had never intended to create. Educational expansion followed logically from other changes as human development required literacy for the masses, technical training for artisans, and advanced learning for professionals. Elementary schools appeared in villages across the realm, staffed by teachers trained in modern pedagogical methods. Secondary instruction became available to a broader range of students, as class restrictions relaxed and new institutions opened their doors to previously excluded groups. Universities experienced renaissance as political restrictions lifted and academic liberty expanded. Student enrollment increased dramatically, creating the educated middle class that modernizing society required. Professional schools for medicine, law, and engineering produced specialists capable of managing increasingly complex economic and social systems. Yet, education also produced the critical intelligentsia that would challenge the very system that had created them. Military reform proved as necessary as social change, since Crimean disasters had exposed fundamental flaws in organization, equipment, and training. Universal conscription replaced the old system, where nobles avoided service while peasants served for 25 years. All social classes became liable for military duty, though education and wealth could reduce the term of obligation. This democratization helped break down social barriers while creating more motivated and capable forces. Officer training expanded through numies and staff colleges, where leaders received instruction in modern strategy, tactics, and technology rather than mere parade ground drilling. The general staff system modeled on Prussian practice provided systematic planning for national defense. Yet military modernization also created officers educated in European methods who began questioning why their country could not adopt European political institutions as well. Press freedom emerged gradually as media restrictions relaxed enough to permit public discussion of previously forbidden topics. Newspapers and magazines proliferated, creating informed public opinion that could influence policy decisions for the first time in Russian history. Literary journals became forums for intellectual debate, while popular publications brought news and ideas to previously isolated populations throughout the empire's vast territories. Cultural flowering accompanied political liberalization as writers gained unprecedented liberty to explore realistic themes drawn from contemporary life. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and V. created works that gained international recognition while inspiring domestic readers to examine their society's fundamental assumptions. These literary giants explored themes of social justice, individual conscience, and human dignity that provided powerful alternatives to official ideology. Yet their very success raised questions about why such creativity could flourish in literature but not in politics. Revolutionary movements emerged from the frustration of intellectuals who believed transformation's pace too slow and its scope too limited. Herdson's Bell, published in London but smuggled across the frontier, provided criticism and calls for more dramatic action that official media could not contain. Underground organizations like Land and Liberty combined peaceful propaganda with preparation for armed resistance against a system they considered irredeemably corrupt. Violence erupted as some extremists despaired of peaceful change or popular uprising. Kokossov's attempt to assassinate the emperor in 1866 marked the beginning of systematic terrorism that would plague the remainder of the reign. Rather than accelerating reform, this violence actually slowed it by convincing Alexander that further liberalization would only encourage more attacks. Each assassination attempt strengthened the position of conservatives who argued that any concession to progressive demands would be interpreted as weakness. Foreign relations reflected the empire's renewed confidence following successful domestic transformation. Crimean humiliation was gradually overcome through diplomatic skill and selective intervention that demonstrated Russia's recovery as a European power. The Congress of Berlin in 1878 restored the Northern Empire's voice in international affairs, though not without controversy and opposition from other powers who feared renewed Russian expansion. Central Asian conquest proceeded systematically throughout this period, bringing vast territories under imperial control through campaigns that showcase the effectiveness of military reforms. The subjugation of Khabbara and Kokand extended southern borders to Afghanistan and Persia, creating friction with British interests in India. Yet these distant victories could not compensate for the domestic tensions that continued building. Despite successful modernization, Polish nationalism posed the most serious challenge to imperial unity during this period. The 1863 uprising, though ultimately suppressed, revealed the depth of separatist sentiment among the western provinces' educated classes. Harsh repression that followed eliminated Polish autonomy and attempted to Russify rebellious territories. Yet these policies only deepened resentment, while providing ammunition for critics who argued that the empire could never successfully integrate its diverse populations. Economic difficulties mounted during the late 1870s as the costs of military campaigns and railway construction strained the treasury beyond its capacity. Agricultural depression affected both landlords and peasants, while industrial development proved insufficient to absorb surplus rural population. Redemption payments required from former serfs created particular hardship in regions with poor soil or adverse weather, generating the rural discontent that revolutionary movements would eventually exploit. Conservative reaction gathered strength as nobles complained about their reduced status and officials worried about social stability that seemed increasingly precarious. The Loris-Melikov Constitution, which proposed modest steps toward representative governance, divided the ruling elite while alarming traditionalists who feared further erosion of autocratic authority. Alexander found himself caught between progressives demanding faster change and conservatives insisting that existing reforms had already gone too far. Alexander's personal life deteriorated as family scandals and an unhappy marriage added to the burdens of office. His morganatic marriage to Catherine Dolgoruka shocked court society, while his children from this union could not inherit the throne, creating succession complications that worried dynastic conservatives. Public criticism of the emperor's private conduct weakened his moral authority at precisely the moment when political challenges demanded maximum legitimacy. Financial crisis deepened when the Turkish wars costs combined with railway construction expenses to overwhelm the imperial treasury. Currency devaluation affected all social classes, while government borrowing mortgaged the empire's future to foreign creditors. Economic hardship created the social tensions that revolutionary movements exploited. Yet the government lacked resources to address the underlying problems that generated popular discontent. People's will finally achieved its goal of rearcide through the coordinated bombing attack that killed Alexander on March 1st, 1881, the sovereign who had freed 23 million serfs and modernized every aspect of imperial administration, died on a St. Petersburg street, his blood staining the snow as his reign's contradictions claimed their final victim. The Tsar Liberator became the ultimate symbol of reform's limitations. Even the most comprehensive transformation could not resolve the fundamental tensions between autocratic rule and modern society. Death marked the end of an era that had transformed the empire more thoroughly than any period since Peter the Great's original modernization. 25 years of change had eliminated human bondage, created modern legal and educational systems, and established foundations for continued development. Yet the fundamental question of political participation remained unresolved. While the expectations raised among educated classes created pressures that future rulers would struggle to contain. Reform had prevented revolution temporarily, but it had also created the conditions that would make revolution inevitable. Blood on the snow marked more than a sovereign's death. It signaled the beginning of a long twilight that would consume both dynasty and empire. Alexander III, who inherited the throne amid the smoke and terror of his father's assassination, brought to power a worldview that would define the realm's final decades. Absolute resistance to change, uncompromising defense of traditional authority, and fatal blindness to the forces reshaping the modern world. The giant who could bend horseshoes with his bare hands possessed his grandfather's granite certainty, but lacked the strategic intelligence that crisis demanded. Counter-revolution began immediately as the new sovereign abandoned every liberal experiment his father had attempted. The Loris Melikov Constitution, which might have provided a modest outlet for political participation, vanished before implementation. Universities lost their autonomy while appointed supervisors monitored lectures and student activities. Press freedoms evaporated as censorship returned with unprecedented severity, eliminating substantive discussion of public affairs throughout the realm. Russification struck at the empire's diverse nationalities with systematic brutality that had no precedent in the dynasty's history. Finnish autonomy, respected for nearly a century, faced steady erosion as Russian officials replaced local administrators. Polish cultural institutions suffered closure, while native languages disappeared from schools entirely. Jewish communities endured intensified persecution, including state-sponsored pogroms that shocked European opinion and drove millions toward immigration or revolution. Gustavus saw their authority reduced and independence undermined through the appointment of land captains, who gained broad powers over peasant affairs. Legal equality promised by judicial reforms was quietly abandoned as separate. Court systems emerged for different social classes. The service nobility, whose privileges Catherine the Great had codified, found their position strengthened at the expense of the emerging middle classes that modernization had created. Agricultural policy revealed the administration's fundamental inability to address the realm's most pressing problems. Redemption payments that burdened former serfs created chronic rural poverty and periodic famine that the government seemed powerless to prevent. Communal land tenure preserved to maintain social stability, prevented agricultural improvement, and trapped millions in subsistence farming. When crop failures struck in 1891 to 1892, the leadership's inadequate response allowed hundreds of thousands to starve, while grain exports continued to foreign markets. Industrial development proceeded despite official indifference, driven by foreign investment and the energy of private entrepreneurs who recognized opportunities that bureaucrats ignored. Sergei Viti, the brilliant finance minister who understood modernization's necessity, managed to attract European capital through currency stabilization and massive railway construction. The Trans-Siberian Line, begun during this period, represented the largest engineering project in human history, yet also symbolized the regime's preference for grand gestures over systematic reform. Factory growth created new social forces that the autocratic system could not accommodate or control. Industrial workers concentrated in major cities developed collective consciousness through shared hardships and common grievances that no amount of police surveillance could suppress. Professional classes, lawyers, doctors, engineers, teachers emerged with expectations of political participation that clashed fundamentally with traditional absolutism. Revolutionary movements adapted to industrial society's new conditions with organizations, influenced by Marxist theory rather than the romantic populism that had characterized earlier dissent. The Social Democratic Labour Party, founded in 1898, split between Belaviks, demanding disciplined action, and Mensheviks, favoring gradual democratization. Yet both factions shared the conviction that autocracy could not be reformed, but must be destroyed entirely. socialist revolutionaries appealed to a broader constituency through their combination of rural collectivism and urban terrorism. Their assassination campaign against high officials created an atmosphere of perpetual crisis that forced the leadership to rely increasingly on police, surveillance, and armed force. Each successful attack demonstrated the regime's vulnerability, while inspiring further violence from those who had lost faith in peaceful change. Alexander III's sudden death at age 49 brought to the throne his son, a young man whose character combined personal decency with complete unsuitability for absolute rule. Well-meaning but weak-willed, intelligent but poorly educated. Nicholas, too, possessed none of the qualities needed to navigate the approaching storm. His reign would demonstrate that good intentions could not substitute for the strength of character that effective autocracy demanded. Coronation ceremonies in 1896 began with traditional splendor, but ended in catastrophe when a stampede at Kodinka Field killed over 1,000 celebrants. Nicholas's decision to attend a French ambassador's ball the same evening rather than cancelling festivities to mourn the victims became an early symbol of the dynasty's disconnection from popular suffering. This insensitivity would characterize the entire reign as personal tragedies became political disasters. Marriage to Alexandra of Hesse brought personal happiness but political catastrophe. The Empress, Queen Victoria's granddaughter, but raised in insular German court culture, never understood her adopted country or its people. Her mystical Orthodox faith and growing influence over her husband would prove devastating during the coming crisis. While her German origins made her a target for wild rumors about treason that the regime proved powerless to counteract. Industrial expansion that accelerated during the 1890s created unprecedented prosperity for some while intensifying hardship for others in ways that made social explosion increasingly likely. Textile mills of Moscow, steel plants of Ukraine, and oil fields of Baku generated enormous wealth. But working conditions remained primitive while wages barely supported survival. Labor movements spread as employees discovered their collective power to challenge employers, who had previously enjoyed absolute authority. Student unrest became endemic as universities served as focal points for opposition to the entire system. Each police charge against unarmed protesters created new enemies of the autocratic order, while demonstrating the regime's inability to win hearts and minds through persuasion rather than force. The leadership's violent suppression of demonstrations only inflamed public opinion and drove moderate critics toward radical positions. Expansion into East Asia reflected both territorial ambition and domestic calculation as the regime sought patriotic distraction from internal problems. Manchurian occupation and railway construction into Chinese territory promised economic benefits, while the lease of Port Arthur gave Russia its long-sought warm water port in the Pacific. Yet these gains created friction with Japan that the leadership dismissed contemptuously, convinced that European forces would easily defeat any Asian opponent. Japanese concerns about Russian expansion led to tensions that exploded into warfare when diplomacy failed. The leadership welcomed conflict as an opportunity to restore prestige damaged by domestic failures, never imagining that a small, victorious war would become a catastrophic defeat that shattered the regime's credibility entirely. The surprise attack on Port Arthur began a conflict that would expose every weakness in the autocratic system. Military disasters followed one after another as corrupt contractors supplied defective equipment. Incompetent generals squandered soldiers' lives, and inadequate transportation failed to move reinforcements across vast continental distances. The Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese fleet annihilated the Baltic squadron that had sailed halfway around the world, demonstrated complete technological and organizational inferiority that shocked international opinion. Domestic consequences of defeat proved even more devastating than strategic humiliation. The 1905 revolution began with Father Gapon's march to the Winter Palace, where peaceful petitioners seeking redress met volleys of rifle fire. Bloody Sunday shattered the traditional bond between Tsar and people, creating a crisis of legitimacy from which the regime would never recover. Labor strikes spread across the realm as workers abandoned their tools and demanded political change that went far beyond immediate economic grievances. The PM-Can mutiny demonstrated that discontent had penetrated even the armed forces. Traditionally, the throne's most reliable support, transportation workers brought movement to a halt, paralyzing both commerce and administration while revealing the regime's dependence on popular cooperation. October Manifesto promised constitutional monarchy and civil liberties in a desperate attempt to divide the regime's opponents. Constitutional democracy and civil rights satisfied moderate liberals, while disappointing radicals who demanded complete democratization and social revolution. This division allowed the administration to regain initiative through selective concessions and targeted violence against those who refused to accept half measures. Moscow uprising in December 1905 provided the system with an opportunity to demonstrate renewed strength through systematic brutality. Artillery bombardment of working-class districts and mass executions of captured rebels served notice that autocracy, though shaken, retained the will to use force. Suppression of rural revolt through punitive expeditions restored order at the cost of thousands of lives, while creating hatred that would explode again during the next crisis. Parliamentary establishment created the realm's first national legislature, but within strict limitations that preserved autocratic authority, while providing only the appearance of constitutional rule. The fundamental laws issued without consultation defined the ruler as unlimited sovereign whose power was restricted only by his own promises. Ministers remained responsible to the crown rather than the elected body, making genuine parliamentary government impossible. Dissolution of the first two assemblies dominated by opposition parties demanding real, constitutional rule demonstrated the regime's bad faith. Electoral law was then illegally changed to ensure a more conservative composition, creating a legislature that would support official policy rather than represent popular will. This manipulation destroyed whatever credibility the constitutional experiment might have possessed. Pate dominated domestic policy from 1906 to 1911, representing the system's last attempt at systematic modernization before the final collapse. His agrarian reforms aimed to create a class of prosperous peasant proprietors who would support the existing order against revolutionary threats. Dissolution of communal land tenure and encouragement of individual farming promised to transform rural society while maintaining political stability. Field courts-martial executed thousands of revolutionaries and common criminals with summary justice that shocked liberal opinion throughout Europe. The hangman's noose became known as Stolypin's necktie, demonstrating the regime's continued reliance on violence alongside attempts at reform. The Prime Minister's conviction that order must precede freedom reflected the system's fundamental priorities, while revealing its inability to win popular support through positive achievements. Industrial recovery after 1906 created a brief period of prosperity that masked underlying tensions, while providing false confidence about the regime's stability. Foreign investment resumed, factory production expanded, and living standards improved modestly for urban workers. The administration used this breathing space to rebuild armed forces and strengthen international position. Yet fundamental problems remained unresolved. Court scandal dominated the regime's final years, symbolizing the dynasty's complete loss of moral authority. Rasputin, the Siberian mystic, who gained influence through his apparent ability to help the hemophiliac heir, became a symbol of corruption and incompetence that discredited the ruling family among all social classes. His dissolute behavior and political interference provided ammunition for critics, while demonstrating the regime's inability to maintain basic standards of public decency. Stolypin's assassination in 1911 removed the last leader capable of effective administration. His successor lacked both vision and political skill needed to address mounting problems that required immediate attention. The parliament, reduced to impotence through electoral manipulation, provided no alternative source of leadership, while the regime drifted toward catastrophe. International tensions that had been building since the turn of the century reached crisis point in summer 1914. Russia's commitment to Slavic solidarity in Balkan influence created obligations that the leadership could not abandon without complete humiliation. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, mobilization that followed triggered the general European struggle that would destroy the old order entirely. Initial enthusiasm that greeted the declaration provided temporary unity as all classes rallied behind the national cause. Even opposition parties supported the war effort, believing that victory would strengthen constitutional rule while defeat would discredit autocracy. The capital's name changed from Germanic St. Petersburg to Slavic Petrograd, symbolizing the patriotic mood that briefly masked domestic divisions. Early campaigns revealed that the realm's armed forces, though improved since 1905, remained inadequate for modern warfare's demands. The invasion of East Prussia ended in catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Messerine Lakes, where entire armies were destroyed through incompetent leadership and inadequate communication. These disasters shattered illusions about military preparedness while exposing the same organizational failures that had plagued the Japanese conflict. Shell shortage that crippled operations during 1915 exposed the industrial system's inability to support total war. Soldiers faced machine guns with rifles lacking ammunition, while artillery fell silent for want of shells. Retreat from Galicia and Poland cost hundreds of thousands of casualties, while destroying public confidence in the war effort. Each defeat made the regime's position more precarious, while strengthening demands for political change. Nicholas's decision to assume personal command of the armed forces proved politically disastrous. By taking direct responsibility for military operations, he linked the dynasty's fate to battlefield success that proved increasingly elusive. When fighting continued to go badly, criticism that had previously focused on generals now targeted the throne itself, making the emperor personally responsible for every defeat. Alexandra's German origins made her a target for wild rumors about treason and collaboration with the enemy that the regime proved powerless to counteract. Her political interference exercised through incompetent ministers, who owed their positions to Rasputin's influence, paralyzed effective administration at the moment when decisive leadership was most needed. Public opinion, already strained by military defeats, turned decisively against the ruling family. Economic collapse accompanied military failure as the war's costs overwhelmed the realm's resources. Inflation destroyed wages, purchasing power, while shortages of basic necessities created hardship in cities and countryside alike. The transportation system, overburdened by military traffic, failed to deliver adequate food supplies to urban populations that began facing starvation. Rasputin's murder by aristocratic conspirators in December 1916 came too late to save the dynasty's reputation. The scandal of his rise to influence had already convinced most educated citizens that the ruling family was unfit to govern. Even conservative nobles who had traditionally supported the throne now spoke openly of the need for change, leaving the regime completely isolated. Industrial unrest resumed during winter 1916 to 1917 as workers faced starvation, wages, and food shortages that made survival increasingly difficult. Police reports warned of growing revolutionary sentiment, but Nicholas dismissed such warnings as exaggerated while remaining convinced that the people remained loyal to their czar. This delusion prevented recognition of the system's complete isolation from popular support. Bread riots that began in Petrograd during the first week of March 1917 seemed initially like previous disturbances that had been suppressed through force. When garrison regiments joined the demonstrators rather than firing on them, the February Revolution became unstoppable. Within a week, the realm that had dominated Europe for 2 centuries ceased to exist as its final ruler abdicated in a railway car at an obscure provincial station. Nicholas's abdication, signed at Pskov, ended the Romanov dynasty that had governed for over 300 years. His attempt to pass the crown to his brother was rejected, leaving the country without a monarch for the first time since the medieval period. The realm that had survived foreign invasion, internal rebellion, and social upheaval finally succumbed to the contradiction between autocratic government and modern society that had been building for over a century. Abdication came with a few strokes of a pen in a modest railway car at an obscure station witnessed only by officers, whose loyalty had already transferred to other masters. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended not with battlefield defeat or palace coup, but with a quiet surrender that left the largest contiguous realm in human history. Suddenly, without legitimate authority, its diverse peoples free to determine their own fate. Prince Djagilov, the liberal aristocrat who emerged as head of the provisional administration, inherited challenges that would have daunted far more experienced leaders. Catastrophic military situation, economic collapse, social upheaval, and complete breakdown of administrative authority across 11 time zones. His temporary leadership claimed legal legitimacy but lacked effective control. Dual authority characterized the uprising's early months, creating paralysis when decisive action was most needed. While the Provisional Administration possessed legal status, the Petrograd Soviet commanded popular loyalty but refused administrative responsibility. This division reflected deeper contradictions within society about the proper pace and direction of change. Alexander Kinsky embodied both the transformation's hopes and its limitations. Eloquent and passionate, this socialist lawyer could inspire crowds with visions of democratic progress. Yet he possessed neither practical experience nor the ruthless determination needed to impose order on chaos. His decision to continue the conflict with Germany and Austria-Hungary proved fatal to credibility. Military offensive launched in June 1917 collapsed within days, triggering mass desertions and confirming popular suspicions that new leaders served the same imperialist interests as the old autocracy. Battle-weary soldiers, land-hungry peasants, and starving workers had heard enough promises. They wanted immediate results. Lenin's return to Petrograd in April aboard the famous sealed train marked the beginning of radicalization. His April thesis demanded immediate peace. Land, redistribution, and transfer of authority to the Soviets, offering simple solutions to complex problems. Peace, land, bread resonated powerfully with audiences, exhausted by 3 years of catastrophic conflict. July Day's uprising, though premature and unsuccessful, demonstrated growing extremist influence among the capital's garrison and factory laborers. Administrative suppression of demonstrations and arrest of radical leaders temporarily weakened the organization, but also radicalized many who had previously supported moderate socialism. General Lava Kornilov's attempted coup in August revealed complete isolation of the temporary leadership. When the commander-in-chief marched on Petrograd to restore order, he found support neither from conservatives who considered him inadequate nor from progressives who viewed him as counter-revolutionary. His failure destroyed the last hope for military dictatorship while discrediting Kinsk's authority entirely. October seizure brought the Radical Party to control through careful planning rather than dramatic insurrection. Storming the Winter Palace, later mythologized as epic battle, involved minimal violence and resistance. Administrative structures simply collapsed. Ministers fled or faced arrest, and legitimacy evaporated like morning mist. First decrees reflected understanding of popular priorities. Peace was offered immediately regardless of territorial losses. Land redistribution promised noble estates to peasant communes. These measures, though impossible to implement overnight, demonstrated commitment to revolutionary change that previous leaders had only promised. Constituent Assembly dissolution in January 1918 marked the definitive end of parliamentary democracy's brief experiment. When elected representatives refused to ratify extremist policies, Lenin ordered the assembly dispersed by force. Democracy of the streets would replace bourgeois parliamentarism, he declared. Though critics recognized only emerging dictatorship Brest's treaty signed in March 1918, purchased peace at enormous territorial cost. Germany and Austria-Hungary annexed vast regions, including Ukraine, Baltic provinces, and parts of the Caucasus. Territory containing 1/3 of the former realm's population and much of its industrial capacity was surrendered, confirming opponents' charges that radicals served German interests. Civil conflict erupted in summer 1918, plunging the former realm into struggle more devastating than world conflict itself. White armies formed in the south under General Denkin, in Siberia under Admiral Kolch, and in the northwest under General U. Each promised legitimate restoration, though they differed fundamentally about what legitimacy meant. Imperial family execution in an Otterenberg basement eliminated any possibility of monarchist restoration while demonstrating extremist determination to destroy the old order completely. Innocent children murdered alongside their parents, shocked international opinion and provided powerful propaganda for the white cause. Foreign intervention complicated internal conflict by providing whites with arms and supplies, while giving radicals a patriotic rallying cry. British, French, American, and Japanese forces occupied strategic points around the former realm's periphery, ostensibly securing military supplies, but actually supporting anti-radical forces. Trotsky's Red Army emerged from revolutionary chaos with remarkable effectiveness despite improvised character. Former officers coerced into service through family threats, provided professional expertise, while political commissars ensured ideological reliability. Technical competence combined with radical fervor overcame white advantages in equipment and external support. Green movement represented a third force that both Reds and Whites ignored at their peril. Peasant armies, led by figures like Nista Makhno in Ukraine, fought for local autonomy and agrarian socialism against all centralized control attempts. Guerrilla tactics disrupted supply lines and communications throughout the conflict. Economic policies during internal struggle reflected ideological commitments as much as practical necessities. War, communism abolished money, nationalized industry, and requisitioned agricultural surplus, aiming to construct socialism directly from revolutionary enthusiasm. Results proved catastrophic. Industrial production collapsed, cities emptied, and millions died in famines. Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921 marked the end of the heroic phase when sailors who had been the radicals' most loyal supporters demanded political freedom and economic reform. Leadership responded with swift brutality. Kronstadt's suppression demonstrated that dictatorship of the proletariat meant dictatorship over the proletariat. New economic policy introduced in 1921 represented tactical retreat from pure socialism. Private trade was legalized. Small-scale manufacturing permitted and peasants allowed to sell surplus crops for profit. Mixed economy produced rapid recovery, while ideological purists complained about capitalism's restoration. Union of Soviet Socialist Republics formation in 1922 created a new political entity that formally succeeded the old realm while maintaining territorial integrity. Federal structure granted nominal autonomy to non-Russian peoples while ensuring radical control through Communist Party centralization. Lenin's death in January 1924 triggered succession, struggle that would determine the new polity's future direction. Conflict between Stalin's socialism in one country and Trotsky's permanent revolution reflected deeper questions about relationships between ideological purity and practical governance. Stalin's victory marked emergence of new absolutism, combining modern organizational techniques with traditional centralization. 5-year plans, collectivization campaigns, and political purges created totalitarian systems more comprehensive than any previous dictatorship. Human costs exceeded even the bloodiest periods of the previous era. Continuities between old and new. Governance became apparent as leadership consolidated authority. Secret police, though renamed and reorganized, performed similar functions to the third section. Administrative apparatus, despite ideological transformation, maintained identical hierarchical structures and bureaucratic culture. Industrial development accelerated under the new system, fulfilling ambitions that previous reformers had cherished but never achieved. Massive steel mills, hydroelectric dams, and manufacturing complexes transformed predominantly agricultural society into modern industrial power within a single generation. Collectivization destroyed traditional rural society while causing famines that killed millions. Victory over Nazi Germany in World War II restored the Union's great power status while validating Stalin's harsh developmental policies. Red Army forces marching into Berlin carried hammer and sickle rather than double-headed eagle, but their triumph recalled earlier victories over Napoleon and other foreign invaders. Cold War confrontation created bipolar world order in which the Union confronted the United States as equal superpower. Nuclear arsenals, space programs, and global influence represented fulfillment of territorial dreams that had seemed impossible under the Yet fundamental contradictions that had destroyed the old realm remained unresolved. Tensions between modernization and tradition, central control and local autonomy, territorial ambitions and economic limitations continued shaping political development. Union collapse in 1991 marked the final end of the political entity that had merged from Muscovite Principality 6 centuries earlier. Dissolution was peaceful rather than violent, administrative rather than revolutionary. Legacy of the old realm lives on throughout territories it once controlled. Orthodox Christianity, suppressed but not destroyed during socialist periods, has experienced revival in post-communist areas. Bureaucratic traditions continue influencing contemporary governance. Geopolitical ambitions remain visible in current policies. Cultural achievements, Pushkin and Tolstoy's literature, Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky's music, Rapin and Kandinsky's art have transcended historical context to become part of world civilization. Educational and scientific traditions provided foundations for technological achievements despite political upheavals. National consciousness questions that plagued the old realm remain unresolved in contemporary territories. Relationships between ethnic heritage and citizenship, Orthodox Christianity and secular governance, European orientation and Eurasian character continue generating political debate and social tension. Historical experience offers both positive and negative lessons for understanding development. Achievements in territorial expansion, cultural creation, and administrative organization demonstrate potential for constructive change. Failures in political modernization, social justice, and economic progress reveal costs of authoritarian governance. Comparison between old and new systems suggests that governing the world's largest territorial entity creates similar challenges, regardless of ideological framework. Geographic scale, ethnic diversity, economic backwardness, and security concerns transcend particular political structures. Memory of greatness continues influencing political discourse and international relations. Nostalgia for superpower status, sensitivity to foreign criticism, and desire for international respect reflect psychological legacies persisting into contemporary periods. Understanding rise and fall provides insight into broader processes of development, democratization, and nation-building shaping global progress. Stories illustrate both possibilities and limitations of authoritarian modernization in societies struggling to adapt to changing international conditions. Ultimate significance lies not in political achievements but in contributions to human civilization. Attempts to create multinational entities based on Orthodox Christianity and autocratic governance failed politically, but produced cultural achievements enriching global heritage. Old orders' end marked not just political collapse, but conclusion of particular approaches to organizing human society. Beliefs that enlightened absolutism could promote progress while maintaining stability proved inadequate to modern challenges. Yet experiments produced valuable lessons about relationships between authority and creativity, tradition and change, unity and diversity. Stories become part of larger human narratives attempting to create order, meaning, and beauty in uncertain worlds. Successes and failures illuminate eternal tensions between desires for greatness and needs for justice, between claims of tradition and demands of progress, between dreams of rulers and hopes of peoples. Although the throne of the Russian Empire is now vacant, the architectural, artistic, and military legacy it left behind continues to influence the world today. Completing this northern panorama, we witnessed how power and geography converged. Take care of yourselves until our next journey of discovery.